A new study on high carb fueling just came out with some on social media claiming that it gives a performance boost equal to super shoes. But is that what the study really shows about the possible benefits of high carb fueling? To answer that question, we'll need to take a closer look at what the study actually tested to see if the claims of super shoe equivalency stack up. First thing I want to say about this study, which was published in the Journal of Applied Physiology, is that it was really well done. The methods are very sound, and impressively, they recruited 8 elites to highly trained marathoners, men, who had an average personal best of 2 hours and 22 minutes. Obviously, 8 is not a very big study, not a big sample, but given the caliber of runner that they recruited, it's not particularly realistic to get many more than that in a relatively small geographical region. For the study, the participants did 3 2-hour running trials with different carbohydrate feeding strategies, which were 60 grams an hour, 90 grams an hour, and 120 grams an hour. The carbohydrate in the 60 gram per hour condition was all from maltodextrin, whereas the 90 and 120 gram per hour conditions used maltodextrin to fructose ratios of 2:1 and 1:1 respectively. In terms of intensity, the first 15 minutes of each run was done at 95% of lactate threshold. The next 90 minutes were done just below marathon pace, and the final 15 minutes again were done at 95% of lactate threshold. So a pretty high intensity 2-hour run, done 3 separate times with each of those carbohydrate feeding conditions. Important to note, the researchers didn't examine performance, which is completely understandable given the extreme demands that they already placed on these volunteers. To ask them to complete 3 separate performance tests at the end of 3 challenging 2-hour runs would probably be going a bit too far, and if I had a guess, would have reduced the overall recruitment rate in the number of people that were willing to volunteer. So what did the researchers find? Well, first off, they found that runners were able to oxidize much of the ingested carbohydrate in all 3 conditions with efficiency rates of 89%, 87%, and 85% going from the 60 to 90 to 120 gram per hour conditions. The main result that ties into the super shoe claim is that the 120 gram per hour condition led to 2.6% lower oxygen cost compared to the 60 gram per hour condition. For context, improvements in running economy from super shoes typically range from about 2 to 4%. This reduction in oxygen cost with the 120 gram per hour condition makes some sense because by oxidizing carbohydrate, we're able to get a bit more energy out of every liter of oxygen as compared to oxidizing fat. In essence, carbohydrate is a more efficient fuel when it comes to oxygen use. Now, I want to be clear that the researchers themselves never made any claims about super shoe comparisons. They actually stated in their paper, the absence of performance-based measures also means that we're unable to directly assess the impact of carbohydrate dose on exercise performance, and this clearly warrants future investigation. So they themselves were not making claims about high carbohydrate fueling being equivalent to super shoes. This sort of claim has been on social media and in some headlines that have been promoting the study. Since performance wasn't directly tested in the study, what other information in the paper can we draw upon to make some informed guesses as to the potential performance implications of ingesting 120 grams per hour of carbohydrate while marathon running? Fortunately, the researchers also measured heart rate and perceived exertion during the testing, 2 variables that can potentially serve as guideposts for telling us what might actually happen to performance in a realistic environment. Looking at the heart rate and RPE, or rating perceived exertion figures from the paper, we see absolutely no differences between the 3 carbohydrate doses, which suggests despite the better oxygen efficiency with the high carbohydrate 120 gram per hour condition as compared to the 60 gram per hour condition, there did not appear to be any cardiovascular or perceived effort benefits. This is important because one of the things we see with super shoes is not only reductions in oxygen cost with a given running speed, but we also typically see reductions in heart rate and perceived effort levels. Now, not all studies show that with super shoes, but there's enough of them and enough examples to think that most runners are going to get some sort of benefit when we think about reductions in cardiovascular load or reductions in perceived effort. So ultimately, I'm not sure that this oxygen cost benefit with 120 grams per hour of carbohydrate as compared to 60 grams an hour, in the absence of any heart rate or perceived effort benefits, is going to translate to improved performance. Keep in mind, isolated changes in oxygen costs don't universally equate to changes in performance. Let's consider another nutritional intervention as an example: caffeine supplementation. While it hasn't been reported in all studies on the topic, there are several examples from the literature showing that ingesting caffeine before exercise can slightly increase oxygen cost for a given workload. Let's take a look at a couple of examples. The first study showing that a high dose of caffeine may increase the oxygen cost of rowing by about 4%. In a second study showing that a similar increase in oxygen cost can occur during cycling when caffeine and taurine are co-ingested beforehand. While there may be a few reasons for the increase in oxygen cost with high-dose caffeine supplementation, one of the main ones is increases in ventilation. So heavier breathing may equate to more musculature involvement, especially with the muscles that are regulating breathing. And that might explain why we see a few percent increase in oxygen cost with caffeine supplementation in some studies. Now, despite these potential increases in oxygen cost with high-dose caffeine supplementation, we don't actually see any negative impacts on performance or perceived effort. In most cases, we actually see the opposite effect: better performance, reduced effort at a given workload when we supplement with caffeine. So this is a kind of a counterexample where we have an intervention that may actually increase oxygen costs for a given workload, but leads to improvements in performance and lower perceived effort. The broader point being, you don't necessarily want to just look at oxygen cost in isolation and make a judgment about what that's going to mean to performance without looking at other information like perceived effort. In addition, if we look at that study on high carbohydrate fueling that was just published, what we see is that the 120 gram per hour condition seemed to have the most gut problems, which is not particularly surprising given what we know from previous studies on the topic. Specifically in this study, peak symptoms of nausea, stomach fullness, and abdominal cramps were greatest in that 120 gram per hour condition. The increased gut symptoms with high carbohydrate fueling may help explain why in the handful of existing studies on this topic that have compared very high rates of carbohydrate ingestion against somewhat lower rates, the highest dosages of carbohydrate have either failed to improve performance or even resulted in somewhat worse performance. Now, to be clear, I don't think we should conclude based on this study or any other study right now that 120 grams per hour of carbohydrate has no benefits to performance. But I think the idea that fueling with carbohydrate at those rates is the same thing as super shoes is far-fetched given the current science that we have. What we do know is that if you decide to really push the envelope with high carbohydrate fueling, you'd be wise to train your gut to handle all those carbs, because if you don't, you're probably just wasting your time and your energy.